This is a video of cluster munitions being used in Ukraine. So you can see it's not a perfect circle or a perfect rectangle, but the bomblets do have pretty good coverage in the target area. Little better video here, maybe because it's daylight, and we'll watch some of these strikes come in. Little better coverage there. You can see more of a circle than anything else. Looks like infantry positions, trenches. So some right on top of each other, some kind of spread out. That's the challenge when it comes to deploying some sort of cluster munition like this. If you think about it, small bomblets being released from a fast-moving projectile and then, floating down to earth, it's just not going to be perfect in where they hit. We do, and we are able to plan for a general rectangle of an area that'll be affected, but you can see, even with 5 meter, I think it's 4 meter blast radius, lethal blast radius for each one of those submunitions. I wouldn't want to be above ground with a DPICM round headed my way, but there are a lot of gaps in the coverage, right? So one round of DPICM is not going to blanket that whole area. And even if you layer 2, 3, 4, 20 on top of one another, again, bad day for anybody or any light-skinned vehicles or even armored vehicles to a degree in that general target area. But there's also going to be a lot of, portions within that rectangle, if you will, that are going to survive to fight another day. Mines and artillery, that's what we've got today. So I got a video showing an improvised Ukrainian remote mine lane system, pretty similar to something that Russia uses that I showed in a previous video. We've got a 2S7, just a beast of a howitzer firing, actually kind of in slow motion, a pretty cool clip. And then a CEASAR self-propelled howitzer. It's one of the more advanced wheeled howitzers on the modern battlefield. This is a modified Ukrainian remote mine lane system. So in a previous video, I showed the Russian UMZ, and that's more of a, that's a military manufactured piece of equipment. This, on the other hand, looks like some guys put it together in the back of, wait till you see this truck, it's pretty beat up. But the technology behind it isn't crazy. I think the Russian variant, the way they put it together, just because it's, more formally manufactured, we'll say, professionally manufactured, has more pods and has more of a remote detonation characteristic. I think the guy firing these is actually sitting inside the truck. But the general gist behind these is they're loading these pods into, or these canisters that have rockets, a rocket booster in the base of it. Inside those canisters are some mix of anti-personnel or anti-tank mines, usually anti-personnel, just given the size. They're able to then lay a large number of these over a certain area of the battlefield pretty quickly, a lot faster than if you were to lay them by hand. This video actually does a pretty good job of showing what these look like as they fall. So this looks like the firing mechanism, remote, I guess, but this is pretty old-fashioned. Looks like they dug that up from a few years ago. And this is how the mines then are actually deployed. So you can see them fired in the air. The mines scatter over a set area. And that thing kind of flapping down in the wind, I think that's a parachute. And I'll explain that right here. So you see that little, it's not a detonation. There's something called a POM3 mine, POM3 mine. And I think that's what we're seeing here at the end of this video. What those do is when they hit the ground, there's a mechanism that triggers forcing them upright. So they're designed to be dropped out of aircraft or fired from artillery, or in this case, the back of a truck. And because that is their delivery mechanism, they're outfitted with a little parachute. I think that's what was flapping there and not actually deploying, because they're not meant to be fired from, the back of a truck for maximum effectiveness. They should have been dropped from much higher up, and then the parachute actually deploys. So anyways, the way this POM3 works is that when it hits the ground, again, falling from overhead, it could land on any side, and it kicks those legs out to stand the mine upright. It then uses seismic sensors to determine if a person is walking by. This is an anti-personnel mine, at which point it detonates, and it's got a blast radius of like 16 meters. So it's a pretty nasty mine given the size, and pretty advanced, all things considered. A couple topics worth hitting on in this video. So first, the deployment of the mines. The reason they're able to be laid like this and they don't blow up as soon as they hit the ground is that most of these, or at least the ones that they would use to deploy in this manner, have a sort of delayed fuse mechanism. So after the mine is fired or released from an aircraft or falls out of the back of an artillery shell, there's a period of time there, seconds or even minutes, before the mine becomes active. So that gives it plenty of time to fall from, real high up or just bounce around on the ground like you saw in this video before it becomes active. The second big issue here is marking minefields, and it's entirely possible that this minefield is marked, even though it kind of looks like it's just completely scattered to the wind. The reason for that is that minefields aren't marked with, a stick next to each and every mine that's out there, but generally in a broad area. So, a ways from the front, back on some internal system. Again, perfect world. Hopefully this is being done. Ukraine and Russian elements would be providing kind of coordinates of saying, this 5 kilometer by 2 kilometer stretch is mined. Something that would at least give some notification to friendly elements that are rotating through that theater of operations or that portion of the front, and of course provide some level of guidance for after the war. It would help as demining assets pour into the country, they're able to recognize that certain areas are heavily mined and can move that equipment in before civilians move to reoccupy some of these areas. This 2S7, which is a 203 millimeter howitzer, can sling 150-pound rounds up to 55 kilometers away. Now, the distance isn't really the big thing here. It's the size of the round. I mean, there are 152 and 155 millimeter howitzers, kind of the more NATO and Russian standard that can range similar distances. It's the size of the round. 203 millimeters, roughly 30% larger than the standard artillery ammunition in both the Russian and NATO inventories. Now, the 2S7 is a self-propelled howitzer of sorts, but it's a little bit different, right? It looks a lot different than what we see in more traditionally tracked or wheeled self-propelled models. And it's not as fast as some of the others either, especially when we're talking about shooting and scooting, getting out of the firing point before being detected, and you can be engaged with counter battery fire or drones. Now, the 2S7 is operated by a crew of 14, which is like 3 to 4 times the size of what you see from a more traditional self-propelled howitzer, either wheeled or tracked. So when it comes to speed of operations, even with that larger crew, the 2S7 can take 5 to 6 minutes to set up before firing their first round, and another 5 to 6 minutes to get out of there after the last round leaves the tube. That said, the impact from a 203 millimeter round is pretty substantial, which is, why the 2S7 still has a place on the modern battlefield. Here we've got the French CEASAR, which is a self-propelled 155 millimeter howitzer. The standard range is around 40 kilometers, with rocket assist can reach out to around 50 kilometers. But that's not the impressive thing here. What's really unique about this, and some other more modern self-propelled systems, is that once it stops, it can get its first round down range in 60 seconds, and after the last round is fired, be off the firing point in around 40 seconds. And when you're talking about the ever-present threat of counter battery fire, like we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, that time to fire and displacement time is pretty hard to beat. Now, the CEASAR can carry up to 18 rounds, and one way the weapon system could be utilized is it could be held back in a covered and concealed position, and as fire missions start to materialize, start driving, recognizing where a few, relatively flat firing points might be located. Now, to successfully engage a target with artillery, a few key pieces of information are required, right? You have to know where the target is, and then you have to know where the cannon is. And from that, you can calculate the appropriate firing data to put rounds on target. Now, the CEASAR is able to self-lay. So what that means is while the howitzer is driving around, they can receive a fire mission while they're still moving. That gives them the target location they need to fire. And then as soon as the vehicle stops, they, of course, have the howitzer, the gun data. The system then can automatically calculate that firing location and start to move the howitzer to the appropriate deflection and elevation. And supposedly, according to their marketing materials at least, can be ready to fire that first round in under 60 seconds. Now, the CEASAR is not exactly a brand new system. It's been around like 15 years, which I guess compared to some other weapons being used in this or any war, 15 years is actually pretty recent. But France has deployed this to support their combat operations in places like Afghanistan and Mali. Then when the current war kicked off between Ukraine and Russia, France and Denmark donated right around 50 of the CEASARs to the Ukrainian military. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack if interested. The link is in the description below. But thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.